useless, so you can kill me if you want to. And the other wolf says, yeah, you're pretty useless and I could tear out your throat, but tomorrow we might need to bring down a wolf, or a moose, so I'll keep you around. And it's not like they think that, because they don't know. They don't think that. They act it out as a behavioral pattern. Then if you're an anthropologist or an ethologist, and you went and watched the wolves, you'd say it's as if they were acting according to the following rule. And that often confused me, because I thought, well, do wolves act out rules? And I thought, no. A rule is what we construct when we articulate a behavioral pattern. Right? We observe a stable behavioral pattern, and when we articulate it, we can call it a rule. But for the wolves, it's not a rule, it's just a stable behavioral pattern. And so we acted like wolf troops or chimpanzee troops, all of that, and for untold tens and perhaps hundreds of millions of years before we were able to formulate that pattern of behavior in anything approximating a story or an image, and even longer before we could articulate it as a set of ethical rules. And I'm dwelling on this. I know I've repeated some of this before, but it's so important because, there's this tremendous push, especially from the social constructionists, to make the case that ethics is arbitrary, morality is relative, there's no fundamental biological grounding in relationship to human behavior, especially in the category of ethics. And I think that's, well, first of all, it's dangerous, because that means that people are anything you want to turn them into, and you bloody well better be careful of people who think that. And second, I just think that the evidence that that's wrong is so overwhelming that we should just stop thinking that way. I mean, and that's partly why I'm also attacking this from an evolutionary perspective. There's lots of converging lines of evidence that ethical standards of at least of the most crucial sort not only evolve, but also spontaneously reemerge, for example, in the dramatic play of children. So we need to take that seriously. And so, well, that's partly what we're doing here, trying to take that seriously. So, okay, so the idea there, at least in part, was that the father employed the son to generate habitable order out of chaos. I also think there might be something more proximally true about that as well, too, because one of the things we do know, here's something that's cool about men. Men are much more criminal than women. And that, by the way, that does not look like it's sociocultural, partly because it peaks when testosterone kicks in around 14, like it just spikes the hell up, and then it stays pretty high until about 27. And so standard penological theory, for those of you who don't know this, is that if you have a repeat offender, a guy, he just won't stop getting in trouble, you just throw him in prison until he's 28. And it isn't like you're rehabilitating him or anything. It's like by 28, he's done with his criminal career, because the crime curve peaks at 15 and then falls down around 27 or so, it burns out. And that's often, by the way, that's often when men get married and settle down and stabilize. One of the things that's cool about that is the creativity curve for men is almost exactly the same thing. It ramps up when testosterone kicks in, and then it starts to flatten out around 27. The curves match very, very closely. So that's quite cool. It's the creativity element of it that I'm particularly interested in, because their creativity is, in many ways, an attribute of youth. And that's, look, I mean, if you looked at that sentence and you stripped it of its religious context, what you would say is that, well, the older people use the younger people to generate creative ideas and renew the world. It's like, yeah, that's what happens. And we also have no idea how many of the things that we discovered or invented as human beings were stumbled across by children and adolescents. Because they're much more exploratory. They're less constrained by their already extant knowledge structures, and they're less conservative. So, yeah, that seems just right to me. So, and right in an extraordinarily important way. Because it also means that if you're an actual father, one of the things that it means is that that's part of what you should be encouraging your son to do, right? Which is because the role of a father is to encourage. That is clearly the role. And to encourage is to say, well, go out there confront the chaos of the unknown and the chaos that underlies everything and grapple with it, because you can do it. You're as big as the chaos itself, and, do something useful as a consequence and make your life better and make everyone else's life better, and, you can do it. And man, that's the right thing to tell. That's the right thing to tell young men. And talking to young women is more complicated because they have more, let's say, issues to deal with because their lives are more complicated in some ways. But that's definitely the right thing to be telling your son. And one of the things that I've really noticed recently since I've been lecturing, especially in the last 7 or 8 months, most of my audience has been young men, and I've talked a lot to them about both truth and responsibility. And I think that those are the two things that underlie this capacity. And there seems to me to be a tremendous hunger for that idea. It's not the same idea as rights, It's a very different idea. It's the counterpart to rights. And so it's, life is hard, it's chaotic, it's difficult, it's really definitely a challenge. And so you can either shrink from that, and no bloody wonder, because, it's going to kill you. It's no joke, man. Or you can forthrightly confront it and try to do something about it. Well, what's better? And then you say to the person, look, man, you could do it. Like, that's what a human being is like. And if you just stood up and got yourself together, and you'd find out by trying that you can in fact do that. And I do think that that's a great core religious message as far as I can tell, and I think that's deeply embedded in this sort of idea. So, all right, so this is what I've been telling you. This is something like how knowledge itself is generated. First of all, there's the unknown as such, and that's really what you don't know anything about. And generally when you encounter that, you don't encounter it with thought. You encounter it like this, right? And that's the first representation of the absolutely unknown. It's something that is beyond your comprehension, and it's terrifying. And because it's beyond your comprehension, you cannot perceive it, you cannot understand it, but you still have to deal with it. And the way you deal with it is that you freeze. That's what a basilisk does, say, to the kids in Harry Potter, right? They take a look at it and they freeze. And that's the snake, the terrible snake of chaos that lives underneath everything. You see that thing freezes you. And that's because you're a prey animal. But at the same time, it makes you curious. And so that's the first level of contact with the absolute unknown, is the emotional combination of freezing and curiosity. And that's reflected, I think, in the dragon stories. The dragon is the terrible thing that lives underground that hoards gold or hoards virgins. Very, very strange behavior for a reptile, as we pointed out before. But the idea is that it's a symbolic representation of the predatory quality of the unknown combined with the capacity of the unknown to generate nothing but novel information. And you can see that as very characteristic of human beings, because we are prey animals. But we're also unbelievably exploratory, and we're pretty damn good predators. And we occupy this weird cognitive niche. And so one of the things we've learned is that if we forthrightly confront the unknown, terrifying as it is, there's a massive prize to be gained continually. And so that seems to be true, right? As true as anything is. And then I would also say that idea, now we know that one of the metaphors that underlies God's extraction of habitable order out of chaos at the beginning of time is an older idea, and a more archaic idea, that God confronted something like the Leviathan. That's one of the words for this serpent-like chaos creature that's often used in the Old Testament, or there's the Leviathan and the Behemoth. Yeah, that's the other thing. And so there's this idea that I think probably came from the Mesopotamians, that God, either in the son-like aspect or in the father-like aspect, is the thing that confronts this terrible beast that represents the chaotic unknown and cuts it into pieces, and then sometimes gives the body parts to the populace in order to feed them. So you can see a hunting metaphor there as well, but it's deeper than that. And so, all right, so the first thing is that there's the absolute unknown, and the unknown is what you do not understand. It's what's beyond the campfire. Maybe it's what's beyond the tree, even more anciently, when we lived in trees. It's out there where you don't know. And what's out there? Crocodiles and snakes and birds of prey and cats and all sorts of things, like predatory cats, and they will eat you. But there's utility in going out there to find out what's there. Like maybe you go and you don't kill the snake, you kill the damn nest of snakes. And that makes you pretty popular, just as you should be. And that accelerates your reproductive potential, let's say. And we're descended from people who did that. And so we have this notion about how the world is structured that's deeply embedded in our psyche. Like really, really deeply, way, way down, way below the surface cognition. Way down in the limbic system, in these ancient parts of the brain that are like 60 million years old or 100 million years old or older than that. Ancient, ancient brain structures. And so the first thing we do is we act out our encounter with the unknown world. And we act that out in the same way, in a manner that's analogous to the manner that's presented as a description of what it is that God does at the beginning of time to extract habitable order out of chaos. And I won't tell you about the other part of that for now. So you act it out first. And then the second thing is, you watch people who act it out and you start to make representations of that. That's stories, right? And maybe you admire them. And then after a long time, you collect a bunch of those stories and then you can say what that is. You can articulate it as a pattern. And this is something Nietzsche also figured out to begin with, because prior to Nietzsche, I would say, he did so many things first. It was quite remarkable. There was an idea that you first think and then you act. And people like to think that, but of course it's complete bloody rubbish because you're as impulsive as you can possibly imagine. You're always doing things before you think. And sometimes that's a really good idea. So the idea that you see things and then think and then act, it's like, yeah, really? No, I'm sorry. I don't do that. No one I know does that, and they certainly don't do that when they're emotional. You act first. And one of the things that Nietzsche said very clearly was that our ideas emerged out of the ground of our action over thousands and thousands of years. And then when philosophers were putting forward those ideas, what they were doing wasn't generating creative ideas. They were just telling the story of humanity. It's already there. It's already in us. It's already in our patterns of behavior. And it strikes me that he was a genius, and that was one of his many, many observations of pure genius. And so you can think about it, like this too, is that there's the unknown and then you act in the face of the unknown and then you dream about the action. That's what you're doing in a movie theater. And then you speak about it. And so, and of course, once you speak about it, that affects how you dream, and how you dream affects how you act. It's not like all of the causal direction is one way, because it's not. These things loop. But it's still from the unknown through the body, through the imagination, into articulation. That's the primary mode of the generation of wisdom, let's say. And you can easily map that onto an evolutionary explanation, because the body comes first, right? And then the imagination, which is the body in abstraction, and only then the word. And of course, that's exactly how things did evolve, because we could imagine things long before we could speak. At least that's the theory. And I represented it. This is an image from my book, Maps of Meaning. And so the idea is that this is the fundamental representation of the unknown as such. It's half spirit, because it partakes of the air like a bird, and it's half matter because it's on the ground like a snake. And that's what you think is there when you don't know what is there. That's how your body reacts to what's there when you don't know what is there. You know that too, because if you're alone at night, and maybe you're a little rattled up for one reason or another, maybe you watched a horror movie and, there's some weird noise in the other room, it's dark, and you could just try this once. It's like, so you're on edge, you think, you want to turn the light on and go in the room and see. Don't do that. Just open the door a little bit and sneak your hand in. And just watch what your imagination fills that room with, right? And then you remember what it's like to be 3 years old in bed and afraid of the dark, right? And I read a good book on dragons recently that had a very interesting hypothesis about them, I thought. One of the things the guy did was track, I can't remember his name, unfortunately, track how common the image of the dragon was worldwide. It's unbelievably widespread. It's crazily widespread. And he thought that this was actually the category of primate predator. And the predator predator is a weird category, right? Because there's crocodiles in it and there's lions, and they don't have much in common except they eat you. So it's a functional category. And so this is the imagistic representation of the functional category of predator. And his predator theory was, well, if you're a monkey, then a bird would pick you off, like an eagle. And so that's this, right? And then if it wasn't an eagle, it was a cat, because they climb trees and give you good chomping. And then if it wasn't a cat, then you go down on the ground and a snake would get you, or maybe a snake would climb up the tree, because snakes like to do that, and get you. And so that's a tree cat snake, basically. Tree cat snake bird. And that's the thing you really, that's the thing you really want to avoid. You don't want to come across one of those. And then, the other thing it does is breathe fire, which is quite interesting, because obviously fire was both greatest friend and greatest enemy of humanity. And we've mastered fire for a long time. It might be as long as 2 or 3 million years. That's what Richard Wrangham, I think it's Wrangham, he wrote a book recently on, I think it was Wrangham, who wrote a book on when human beings learned to cook. That was about 2 million years ago, and cooking increased the availability of calories. You know how chimpanzees are sort of shaped like a big, like they're ugly. They're shaped like a big bowling ball, they look really fat, and they're short and they're wide, and that's because they have intestinal tracts that are like, 300 miles long, and the reason for that is because they have to digest leaves. And so you go out in the forest and sit there and eat leaves for a whole day and see how that works out for you, They have no calories in them. So chimps spend about, I think it's 8 hours a day chewing. And it's because what they eat has no nutritional value, and then they have to have this tremendous gut in order to extract anything at all out of it. And human beings at some point just thought, oh, to hell with that, we'll cook something. And then we traded our gut for brain, which, more or less has worked, and I think it's made us a lot more attractive as well. So the idea here was that, that's the basic archetype of the unknown as such. And then I like the St. George version of this. It's so cool because St. George lives in a castle, and the castle is partly falling down, and it's partly because there's a dragon that's come up to, it's an eternal dragon. It's come back to give everyone a rough time, which always happens, because the eternal dragon is always giving our fallen down castles a rough time. Always. And so then St. George is the hero who goes out to confront the dragon, and he frees the virgin from its grasp. And I would say that's a pretty straightforward story about the sexual attractiveness of the masculine spirit that's willing to forthrightly encounter the unknown. It looks just straight, looks like a straight biological representation to me. And it's a really, really old story, right? It's the oldest written story we have, and that's basically the Mesopotamian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, which basically lays out precisely that story. And it's replayed. I bet you, the moviegoers among you, especially the ones that are more attracted to the superhero, the really flashy sort of superhero type movies, you've probably seen the St. George story 150 times in the last 10 years. You never get tired of it because it's the central story of mankind. So you've got the unknown as such, and that is what you react to with your body in the existential terror and extraordinary curiosity are gripping you. And then it's like the unknown unknowns that, who's the politician under Bush? Rumsfeld. Yeah, I think the reason that phrase caught on so well is because he nailed an archetype. There's unknown unknowns and there's known unknowns. And that's the unknown unknown. And you have to be able to react to an unknown unknown because they can get you. And you can't just plead ignorance because then you're dead. That doesn't work. Human beings are the sort of creature who has to know what to do when they don't know what to do. And that's very paradoxical. And what we do is we prepare to do everything. That's right. We're on guard. We prepare to do everything. Very, very stressful, but also very engaging and very, very much something that heightens consciousness. And maybe those circuits are permanently turned on in human beings because we also know that we're going to die, and no other animal knows that. And so sometimes I think that our stress circuits are just on all the time, and that's part of what accounts for our heightened consciousnness. So you have your unknown unknowns, and then you have your you have the unknowns that you actually encounter in the world, like the mystery of your romantic partner when you have a fight with them. It's like, well, we're having a fight. So who the hell are you? You're not the absolute unknown because I know something about you, but you're the unknown as it's manifesting itself to me right now, right? And then there's the known that we inhabit, and then there's the knower. And the known is given symbolic representation, as far as I've been able to tell, in patriarchal form, in the form of male deities. And the unknown, as you encountered, is given feminine form. So we won't get into that too much, but if you're interested in that, you could look at my Maps of Meanings lectures or maybe take a look at the book. But I think it's a good schema for religious archetypes. I've worked on it a long time. It seems to fit the Jungian criteria quite nicely. It maps nicely onto Joseph Campbell's ideas. He got almost all his ideas from Jung, however. And it also makes sense from a biological and an evolutionary perspective as far as I can tell. And that's a lot of cross-validation, at least in my estimation. So back to the hierarchy of dominance. Well, let's take a look at it a little bit. So I'm quite enamored of lobsters, as some of you might know, because I found out, this just blew me away when I found it out. I mean, I've done a lot of work in neurochemistry, functional neurochemistry, because I used to study alcoholism and drug abuse. And alcoholism, to study alcohol, you have to know a lot about the brain because alcohol goes everywhere in the brain. It affects every neurochemical system. And so if you're going to study alcohol, you kind of have to study neurochemistry in general. And so I did that for quite a long time. I really got enamored of a book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety by Jeffrey Gray, which is an absolute work of genius, although extraordinarily I don't know how many references that book has. It's like, must be 1,000. And Gray actually read them. And worse, he understood them. And then he integrated them into this book. And so to read it, you have to really master functional neurochemistry and animal behaviorism and motivation and emotion and neuroanatomy. Like, it's a killer book, but man, it's really rich. And it's taken psychologists about 40 years to really unpack that book. But one of the things I learned about that was just exactly how much continuity there was in the neurochemistry of human beings and the neurochemistry of animals. It's absolutely staggering. It's the sort of thing that makes the fact of evolution something like self-evident. I do think it's self-evident for other reasons that I'll tell you about later. I think evolution, or I think natural selection, random mutation and natural selection is the only way you can solve the problem of how to deal with an environment that's complex beyond your ability to comprehend. I think what you do is you generate endless variants because God only knows what the hell's going to happen next. Almost all of them die because they're failures, and a couple propagate. And the environment keeps moving around like a giant snake. You never know what it's going to do next. And so the best you can do is say, well, here's 30 things that might work, and 28 of them are going to perish. Or if you're an insect, it's like the ratio is way, way higher than that. So anyways, back to the lobsters. These creatures engage in dominance disputes. And I think dominance is the right way to think about it, because lobsters aren't very empathic and they're not very social. And so it really is the toughest lobster that wins. And what's so cool about the lobster is that when a lobster wins, he flexes and gets bigger, so he looks bigger because he's a winner. It's like he's advertising that. And the neurochemical system that makes him flex is serotonergic. And you think, well, who cares? What the hell does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means. It's the same chemical that's affected by antidepressants in human beings. And so, like, if you're depressed, you're a defeated lobster. Like, you're like this. I'm small. I'm not, things are dangerous. I don't want to fight. You give somebody an antidepressant, it's like up, they stretch, and then they're ready to take on the world again. Well, if you give lobsters who just got defeated in a fight serotonin, then they stretch out and they'll fight again. And that's, we separated from those creatures on the evolutionary timescale somewhere between 350 and 600 million years ago, and the damn neurochemistry is the same. And so that's another indication of just how important hierarchies of authority are. I mean, they've been conserved since the time of lobsters, right? There weren't trees around when lobsters first manifested themselves on the planet. And so what that means is these hierarchies that I've been talking about, those things are older than trees. And so one of the truisms for what constitutes real from a Darwinian perspective is that which has been around the longest period of time, right? Because it's had the longest period of time to exert selection pressure. Well, we know we evolved and lived in trees something on the order of 60 million years ago. We're talking 10 times as far back as that for the hierarchy. And so the idea that that the hierarchy is something that has exerted selection pressure on human beings I don't think that's not a disputable issue. How it's done it and exactly what that means, we can argue about, but that sort of biological continuity is just absolutely unbelievable. It was funny because I revealed this finding. I didn't discover this, I read about it, but I talked to my graduate students about it. I used to take them out for breakfast, and they were a very contentious, snappy bunch. And And they were always trying to one-up each other, and they were quite witty. And for like 6 months, until it got very annoying, every time one of them one-upped the other, they'd stretch themselves out and like snap their hands like. So that was very funny. It was really very funny. So you see this in lobsters, and so that's pretty amazing. So, yeah. And one of the other thing that's really cool about lobsters is that, let's say you've been like top lobster for a long time, but you're getting kind of old, and some young lobster just, whales the hell out of you, and so you're all depressed. But the thing is, your brain is dominant. But you don't have much of a brain because you're a lobster. And so now what are you going to do? Because you just lost. And the answer is, well, your brain will dissolve. And then you'll grow a subordinate brain. Yeah, and so that's worth thinking about too, right? Here, for a couple of reasons. First of all, if any of you have ever been seriously defeated in life, you know what that's like. It's like it's a death, a descent, a dissolution, and if you're lucky, a regrowth, and maybe not as the same person. That's what happens to people with post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Their brains undergo permanent neurological transformation, and they then inhabit a world that's much more dangerous than the world that they inhabited to begin with. But we also know too, if you have post-traumatic stress disorder or depression, that your hippocampus shrinks, right? It dies and shrinks. And you can sometimes get it to grow back. Your hippocampus shrinks and your amygdala grows. And the amygdala increases emotional sensitivity. And the hippocampus inhibits emotional sensitivity. And so if you've been badly defeated, the hippocampus shrinks and the amygdala grows. Now, if you recover, the hippocampus will regrow. And antidepressants actually seem to help that. But the damn amygdala never shrinks again. And so, so that's another lesson from the lobster. It's quite a terrifying one, but it's one, like, it's so interesting that you can relate to that, right? It's like, I get what that poor crustacean's going through, So, okay, here's the rats, and this is from Jaak Panksepp's work. He was the first guy who figured out that rats giggle. And you might think, well, what kind of stupid thing is that to study? It's like $50,000 research grant for giggling rats, So, but he discovered the play circuitry in mammals. That's a big deal, right? It's like discovering a whole new continent. There's a play circuit in mammals. It's built right in, so it's not socially constructed. There's a biological platform for that. And so what Panksepp would do with rats, he found out if you take a rat pup away from its mother, it dies. Even if you feed it, even if you keep it warm, it dies. Now you can stop it from dying by taking a pencil with an eraser on the end and massaging it, right? Because rats won't live without love. And the same thing happens to human babies. And we saw that in Romania when there was that catastrophe after Ceausescu in the orphanages, where the orphanages were full of unwanted babies because Ceausescu insisted that every Romanian woman was constantly pregnant. So the orphanages stacked up with unwanted babies, and lots of them didn't even have names. And they were warehoused. Warmth, shelter, food. Devastating. Lots of them died. Most of them died before the first year. And the ones that didn't die were permanently dysfunctional, because you have to be touched if you're a human being. It's not an option. You have to be played with. It's not an option. It's part of neurodevelopmental necessity. And you have to also play fair. So, because otherwise you produce a very disjointed child who isn't able to engage in the niceties of social interaction, which is continual play in some sense and reciprocity. So what Panksepp did with his rats, he noticed that male rats, juveniles, really like to wrestle. And they wrestle just like human beings wrestle. They pin each other, for crying out loud. It's like that rat has just lost. He's down for a 10 count, right? And so what you do is you take juvenile rats and you can find out that they want to play, because you can attach a spring to them and then they'll try to run, and you can measure how hard they're running by how hard they're pulling on the spring, and then you can estimate how motivated they are. And so you can find out that a nice, well-fed rat who doesn't have anything on his mind will still work hard to play to enter an arena where he's been allowed to play before. He'll work for that. So then you think, well, the rat's motivated. So the two rats go out there and they play, and so they're playing like dogs play, and everyone knows what that looks like. If you have any sense about dogs, they kind of go like this, and kids do that, and maybe you do that with your wife if you're going to play with her a little bit. My poor wife, man, when she had older siblings, and so she wasn't played with as much when she was little as she might have been. And I used to, like, if you take a pillow, and you go like this 3 times, right? That means look out, a pillow is coming your way. So I'd go 1, 2, 3, whap. And she was completely dismayed at me. It's like, what do you do that for? And I thought, well, I eventually taught her that rule. The other thing I used to do... The other thing I used to do, is sometimes she'd come at me like this when we were playing around, and I'd grab her wrists and I'd knock her hands, her knuckles together, and she used to just get completely annoyed about that, and I thought, right? That's what you do. You just open your hands. Well, she didn't know that either, so she hadn't been played with enough when she was a little rat. And so, Anyway, so you let the little rats go out there, right? And so let's imagine one of them is 10% bigger than the other. And so the 10% bigger rat wins, because 10% is enough in rat weight to ensure that you're going to be the pinner rather than the pinnee. Okay, so that's fine. So and then the big rat pins the little rat, and now the big rat is the authority rat. And so then the next time that the rats play, the little rat has to invite the big rat to play. So the big rat's out there being cool, and the little rat pops up and, does the whole will you play with me thing, and the big rat will deign to play with them. But if you pair them repeatedly, unless the big rat lets the little rat win 30% of the time, the little rat will not invite him to play. And Panksepp discovered that. It's like I read that just blew me away. It's like, that is so amazing, because you see, well, first of there's an analogy to Piaget's ideas about the emergence of morality out of play in human beings, so that was very cool. But the notion that was built into rats at the level of wrestling was, and they're deeply social animals, right? They have to know how to get along with one another. And most of their authority disputes, dominance disputes, you don't want them to end in bloodshed and combat. Because, if you're rat 1 and I'm rat 2 and we tear each other to shreds in a dominance dispute, rat 3 is just going to move in. It's really not a great strategy. And so it'd be better if we could settle our differences, somewhat peacefully. And so rats, anyways, Panksepp figured out that rats play. And not only that they play fair, and they seem to enjoy it. He also figured out, this was really cool too, that if you give juvenile rats attention deficit disorder drugs, Ritalin, suppresses play. So that's worth thinking about. It's like, well, why do you have to give juvenile human beings amphetamines in school? Well, because they need to play. Well, they don't get to play. They don't get to wrestle around. I mean, that's oppression as far as I can tell. They don't get to wrestle around. That's fine. Feed them some amphetamines, man. That'll shut down the old play circuits. Well, here's the other problem, is Panksepp found out that if you don't let juvenile male rats play, their prefrontal cortexes don't develop properly. Surprise, surprise, you're not letting them mature. It's like, what else would you expect? So, that's something to think about. Really hard, I would say. So there's some wolves going at it. Well, not exactly. There's some wolves having an authority dispute, let's more technically speaking. And a lot of it's posturing, they tend not, well-socialized wolves tend not to hurt each other during authority disputes because, well, for obvious reasons. It's too dangerous. And so they have other ways of demonstrating who should be listened to, authorities. And there's chimps doing that. Now, I think, if I remember correctly, I think it's right. This is a really cool picture because I think this chimps don't like snakes, by the way. So, for example, if you take a chimp that's never seen a snake and you show it a snake, it is not happy. It will get the hell away from that snake. If you bring a chimp anesthetized into a room full of chimps, the chimps will all get away from that and then look at the body. They don't like that either. And if you bring a big snake into a chimp cage, even if the chimps have never seen it, they'll get away from it and then stare at it. And chimps out in the wild, if they see a big snake, they'll stand there and they have a noise that means something like, holy crap, that's a big snake, It actually means that technically, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But they stand away from it, and then they make this noise, which means, oh my God, look at the snake. And then they'll stand there for 24 hours looking at the snake. And so the snakes are really, really they're super stimuli for chimpanzees, so that's pretty interesting. And this chimp seemed to learn how to take this dead snake and go scare other chimps with it, and that was that was partly how he established his authority. And you know, and well, there's a threat, and like if I was you and I was around that chimp, I would take that threat seriously, because those things are no joke, man. And you see the same thing here with the, I don't remember what kind of monkey that is, but they're engaged in agonistic behavior, and so. And there has been, by the way, there has been recent research showing that in higher order primates that there is snake detection circuitry that's built into them, right? So it's not learned. It's not learned. It's deeper than that. Now, for a long time, psychologists knew for a long time that